The room went quiet when the lawyer looked up, not completely silent. Glasses still touched plates. Someone laughed softly near the window, but the kind of quiet that moves through a room when something has gone wrong. He stared at my boyfriend longer than anyone else in that crowded engagement hall. My sister was standing beside me, smiling for photos. My mother was busy greeting guests. No one noticed the lawyer at first, except me, because he had stopped mid-sentence. His eyes moved from my boyfriend to the documents in his hand, then back again, and something in his expression changed. Not confusion, recognition. Across the table, my aunt leaned toward me and whispered, almost amused, "Your boyfriend looks nervous." I did not answer, because for the first time that night, I realized someone in that room knew something the rest of my family did not. I have always been the quiet one in my family, not the kind of quiet that people admire, the other kind. The kind that makes people assume you are simple or timid or unaware of what is happening around you. My younger sister, Nadia, filled every room she walked into. She spoke easily, laughed loudly, and remembered everyone's name. People were drawn to her without effort. When relatives visited, she was the one they surrounded. When neighbors talked about our family, they mentioned her first. I was usually somewhere behind the conversation, not invisible exactly, but easy to overlook. It never bothered me as much as people assumed it should. I learned early that quiet people hear more than they are supposed to. You notice things when others forget you are there. The engagement party was supposed to be Nadia's night. Our parents had spent months preparing for it. The house was too small for the number of guests they wanted, so the celebration was arranged at a large hall owned by a distant cousin. My mother talked about the event as if it were something delicate that had to be handled carefully. Everything needed to look respectable. Respectable was a word my family valued more than honesty. The evening started early, with relatives arriving long before the official engagement ceremony. Women filled the front tables, exchanging stories that slowly turned into small competitions about whose children were doing better in life. My father moved between groups of guests with the tense politeness he always used during family gatherings. I stood near the side of the room for most of the evening. That was not unusual. I helped the catering staff adjust the seating arrangement when extra chairs were needed. I carried trays when my mother asked. I greeted relatives who had not seen me in months and answered the same predictable questions about work, about marriage, about whether I planned to settle down soon. Most of them asked the question politely. A few of them asked it with amusement, because I had brought someone with me that evening. His name was Samir. We had been together for almost 2 years, though my family spoke about him as if he were still a temporary detail in my life. They had met him before, but only briefly, always during short visits where conversation stayed polite and distant. Samir was not the kind of man my relatives expected me to choose. He was calm in the same way I was. He listened more than he spoke. When people asked him about his work, he gave answers that were simple and short, never expanding into details unless someone insisted. My mother once told me that made people suspicious. "Men who do not talk about their work are hiding something," she had said while folding laundry one afternoon. I remember smiling at the comment but not responding, because in my experience, the opposite was usually true. People who talk too much are often trying to hide something. Samir arrived at the hall shortly after I did that evening. He greeted my parents respectfully, shook my father's hand, and complimented my mother on the decorations she had spent weeks arranging. The exchange was polite, careful, and slightly formal. My mother's smile looked practiced. She had never said anything openly negative about him, but approval and politeness are not the same thing. Nadia, on the other hand, greeted him with enthusiasm. She always did. My sister had a way of making people feel immediately included in whatever moment she was creating. When she saw Samir near the entrance, she walked straight toward him, her engagement jewelry catching the light as she moved. "You finally came," she said with a wide smile. Samir returned the greeting quietly. "I said I would." Nadia laughed lightly, touching his arm in a way that looked friendly, almost theatrical. "You know tonight is important for me," she said. "I know," he replied. I watched them from a few steps away while adjusting the edge of a tablecloth that did not actually need adjusting. Nothing about the interaction seemed inappropriate. It simply lasted longer than most greetings did. Eventually, Nadia's fiancé approached them. The introductions were brief. The two men exchanged polite words and then drifted into separate conversations with other guests. The moment passed, or at least it seemed to. Later, when the room had filled with relatives and the music had started quietly in the background, I found Samir standing near the far wall. He looked calm, comfortable even. "You're very quiet tonight," I told him. He glanced toward the center of the room where my sister was surrounded by cousins and friends. "It's her evening," he said. "It should stay that way." That answer sounded thoughtful, responsible. I remember feeling grateful in that moment that he understood the kind of family I came from. Not everyone did. Many people mistook my family's warmth for sincerity. They did not always realize how much of it depended on appearances. At the time, I believed that night would follow the same pattern as every other family gathering. Polite smiles, careful conversations, nothing truly surprising. I did not know yet that several people in that room were already watching Samir closely. And I certainly did not know that by the end of the evening, one person would recognize him for a reason none of us were prepared to hear. Family gatherings in my family follow a pattern. It is not written anywhere, but everyone seems to understand it. Conversations begin with warmth. Compliments are exchanged. Food is praised. And then, slowly, the questions begin. They never arrive directly. They move around the room first, like careful observers deciding where to sit. I noticed the first shift about an hour after most of the guests had arrived. By then the hall was loud with conversation. My sister sat at the decorated table near the center of the room, while relatives approached one by one to congratulate her. My mother stood nearby, watching everything with the alert attention of someone managing a performance. I was standing beside one of my aunts when she asked me the question I had been expecting all evening. "And where is your young man?" she said. Her tone was light, but her eyes moved around the room as if she were searching for something specific. "He's over there," I replied, nodding toward the far side of the hall. Samir was speaking with two of my cousins near the drinks table. My aunt followed my gaze. For a moment, she did not say anything. Then she smiled in a way that felt slightly rehearsed. "He looks serious tonight." "He usually is," I said. That answer seemed to amuse her. "Well," she said softly, leaning a little closer to me, "a serious man can be a good thing." She paused. "Or a complicated one." Before I could respond, someone called her name from across the room, and she walked away. The comment should have meant nothing. Relatives say strange things at family events all the time. But the way she had looked at Samir lingered in my mind longer than I expected. A little later, I walked across the room to join him. By then my cousins had left, and he was checking something on his phone. "Everything all right?" I asked. He slipped the phone back into his pocket quickly. "Yes." The answer was calm, but something about the movement felt slightly rushed. "Work?" I asked. "Just a message." He did not elaborate. That was not unusual. Samir rarely talked about work in detail, especially in crowded places. Still, I noticed that he glanced around the room once before changing the subject. "Your sister looks happy," he said. I looked toward the center table. Nadia was laughing with a group of friends, her hands moving animatedly as she described something. Her fiancé sat beside her, smiling politely while several relatives spoke to him at once. "She's been planning this night for months," I said. Samir nodded. For a few minutes we stood there quietly, watching the room the way people sometimes do when they are comfortable in silence. Then Nadia suddenly appeared beside us. She moved quickly, the soft sound of her dress brushing the floor as she approached. "There you are," she said, looking directly at Samir. Her voice carried the same bright energy she used with guests. "I've barely seen you all evening." "I didn't want to interrupt anything," he replied. "You're not interrupting," she said. "Your family tonight." The phrase sounded friendly, but it also felt strangely deliberate. She turned to me briefly. "I need to borrow him for a minute." The request surprised me. "For what?" I asked. She smiled easily. "Just a quick question about something." Samir looked at me, waiting. It was such a small moment that refusing would have felt unnecessarily dramatic, so I nodded. "Okay." They stepped a few feet away toward a quieter corner near the windows. At first, I did not pay much attention to their conversation. I turned back toward the center of the hall where my mother was speaking with several guests. But after a minute or two, I noticed something that made me glance toward the windows again. Nadia was asking questions, not casual ones, the kind that required explanation. Her posture had changed slightly, her head tilted in a way that suggested she was listening carefully. Samir answered her calmly, but he kept his voice low, too low for me to hear anything from where I stood. After another moment, Nadia laughed softly. It was a quick sound, but it drew the attention of one of my cousins nearby. He looked toward them, then briefly toward me, and then he looked away again. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, Nadia returned to the center of the room while Samir walked back toward me. "What did she want?" I asked. He shrugged lightly. "Just asking about work." "Work?" She was curious about what I do. That explanation sounded reasonable. Still, something about the moment stayed with me, not because of anything obvious, but because it felt like a conversation that had started before I arrived. Later that evening, I noticed something else. Small things. A cousin stopping his sentence when I approached. My aunt watching Samir again from across the room. And once, near the drinks table, 2 relatives lowering their voices when they realized I was standing behind them. None of it was clear enough to question. Not yet. But the evening had begun to feel different from the way it started. Like a room where a conversation had been happening long before you entered, and everyone else already knew the subject. By the middle of the evening, the celebration had settled into a steady rhythm. Music played softly in the background. Plates were replaced as guests moved between tables. Laughter rose and faded in different corners of the hall. From the outside, nothing about the event looked unusual. But when you are used to watching quietly, you begin to notice when patterns shift. And by that point, several things had begun to feel slightly out of place. The first was Samir's phone. He checked it more often than I had ever seen before. Not constantly. Not in a way that would immediately attract attention, but often enough that I noticed. Each time the screen lit up, he glanced down quickly, read the message, and then slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. At first, I assumed it was work, but after the 4th or 5th time, I began to notice something else. He never opened those messages in front of me. When the phone vibrated, his posture changed slightly, almost automatically. His shoulders would stiffen for a moment before he reached for it. It was a small reaction, but it repeated itself every time. Eventually, I asked him about it. "Busy tonight?" I said quietly while we stood near the side table where drinks were being served. He looked at me. "Not really. You've been getting messages." He hesitated for a moment before answering. Just some things from the office. What kind of things? Scheduling issues. The explanation was simple, too simple. I waited a moment, expecting him to continue, but he didn't. Instead, he glanced across the room again, toward the center table where Nadia sat with her fiancé. That movement felt subtle, but deliberate. Later, when dinner was being served, I noticed something else. Nadia left the main table. At first, it looked like she was simply greeting more guests. She moved through the room slowly, smiling and speaking with relatives who had arrived late. But after a few minutes, I realized she had stopped near the same corner where she had spoken with Samir earlier. And this time, he was already there. The two of them stood beside the tall window that overlooked the parking area outside. From where I was sitting, I could see them clearly. They were speaking again, not casually. Nadia leaned slightly closer as she talked, her expression more serious than it had been earlier. Samir listened with his arms loosely folded. At one point, he shook his head. She said something else. Then he looked toward the center of the room as if checking whether anyone was watching. I lowered my eyes quickly when his gaze moved in my direction. A moment later, my cousin Amir sat down beside me. He followed my line of sight toward the window. "You're very calm tonight," he said quietly. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Nothing." Then he picked up his glass and took a sip. The comment sounded casual, but the way he avoided my eyes afterward made the silence between us feel heavier. A few minutes later, Nadia and Samir returned to the main area separately. She resumed her place beside her fiancé, laughing again as if nothing unusual had happened. Samir walked back toward me. "What happened to dinner?" he asked, glancing at the half-empty plate in front of me. "I wasn't very hungry," I said. He nodded. Neither of us mentioned the conversation by the window, but the moment lingered. For the first time that evening, I felt something I could not easily dismiss. Not anger, not even jealousy, something quieter. A question. The rest of the evening continued. Guests congratulated Nadia and her fiancé. Relatives took photographs in front of the decorated backdrop. Music grew slightly louder as more people began gathering near the dance area. Yet the strange undercurrent in the room did not disappear. It grew. Near the drinks table, I overheard two relatives speaking in low voices. I was not meant to hear them. "Are you sure it's him?" one of them whispered. "I'm telling you, it looks like him. And she doesn't know." There was a brief pause. "I don't think so." When they realized I was standing behind them, both men turned quickly and smiled in the overly polite way people do when a conversation ends too suddenly. The words stayed with me. "It looks like him." I did not know what that meant or who they were talking about. But later, when I saw Samir checking his phone again near the far wall and noticed Nadia watching him from across the room, the question in my mind began to form more clearly. Not a full suspicion. Not yet. Just the quiet realization that something was happening around me. Something several people in that room seemed to understand. Something I was only beginning to see. By the time the engagement ceremony began, the unease had settled somewhere deep in my chest. Not strong enough to create a scene, but strong enough that I could not ignore it anymore. The official part of the evening was simple. Nadia and her fiancé sat together at the decorated table while our parents stood nearby. A few older relatives recited short blessings, and the rings were exchanged under the careful attention of several phones recording the moment. Everyone applauded. My mother wiped her eyes as if she had been waiting years for that exact moment. From the outside, everything looked perfect. I clapped with everyone else, but my attention kept drifting toward Samir. He stood near the back of the room. His expression was neutral. He did not seem distracted anymore, but he also did not move closer to watch the ceremony like most of the other guests. Instead, he remained slightly apart from the crowd, watching. When the applause faded and people began moving around again, I walked toward him. "You've been very quiet tonight," I said. He gave a small smile. "That seems normal for me." I studied his face for a moment. "Did something happen earlier? What do you mean, when you spoke with Nadia?" His smile faded slightly. "Nothing happened. You were talking for a while," he shrugged. "She asked about my job again. That's all." "Yes." The answer came quickly, almost rehearsed. I held his gaze for a moment longer. "Why did you look around the room like that? What do you mean? By the window, you looked like you were checking if someone was watching." For the first time that evening, Samir looked slightly irritated. "You're imagining things." The words were calm but firm. "I'm not imagining," I said quietly. "I saw it." He exhaled slowly and rubbed his forehead. "It's a crowded room," he said. "People look around, that doesn't mean anything." I did not respond. After a moment he added, in a softer tone, "You're overthinking tonight." The phrase landed heavily. Overthinking. I had heard that word many times before, often when someone did not want to answer a question. Before I could say anything else, Nadia approached us again. She looked radiant in the bright engagement jewelry my parents had given her earlier in the evening. "Why are you two hiding over here?" she said playfully. "We're not hiding," I replied. She glanced between us briefly. Something in her expression changed for a fraction of a second. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," Samir said quickly. I looked at him, then back at her. "I was just asking about the conversation you two had earlier." Nadia laughed. "Oh, that? Yes. It was nothing," she said easily. "I was just curious about his work. You asked a lot of questions." "Well," she said, smiling wider, "I'm allowed to talk to my sister's boyfriend." Her tone sounded light, but it also carried a faint edge of amusement. "Of course you are," I said. "So what's the problem?" she asked. "There isn't one." "Then why do you look like you're investigating something?" Samir gave a quiet laugh beside us. "You see," he said, "I told you." "Told me what?" "That you're overthinking." Nadia nodded dramatically. "Oh, she does that," she said to him, "ever since we were kids." "That's not true," I said. She waved her hand dismissively. "You used to think everyone was whispering about you in school, too. That was one time. And it turned out you misunderstood the entire thing," she said. The conversation was beginning to draw attention. Two of my cousins were watching us from a nearby table. I lowered my voice. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said. "I just asked a question." Nadia leaned closer and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. "You should relax tonight," she said softly. "It's my engagement." Her words sounded gentle, but the message underneath them was clear. "Stop asking." Samir nodded slightly in agreement. "Let it go," he said. I looked from one of them to the other, both of them smiling, both of them calm, and suddenly I felt something strange, not anger, something colder, because the way they were speaking to me felt less like reassurance and more like correction, as if I had stepped into a conversation where the roles had already been decided, where I was the one being unreasonable, the one misunderstanding things, the one creating tension during an important family event. A few minutes later, my mother approached us. "There you are," she said. Then she looked directly at me. "Your aunt says you've been asking strange questions." I stared at her. "What?" "She said you were bothering Nadia about a conversation she had earlier." "I wasn't bothering her." My mother sighed quietly. "Tonight is not the night for suspicion." "I'm not suspicious." "Then stop acting like it," she said. Her voice was still calm, but the conversation was finished. Samir stepped away soon after that to greet another group of guests. Nadia returned to the center table where more photographs were being taken, and I remained standing there for a moment, watching the room again. Only now something had changed. Before, the unease I felt had been uncertain. Now it had a shape, not because anyone had confirmed anything, but because everyone had dismissed it too quickly, too easily. and the more they insisted nothing was wrong. The more certain I became that something was. The lawyer arrived later than expected. Most of the older relatives already knew he was coming. My father had mentioned earlier in the evening that some paperwork needed to be finalized for Nadia's engagement. It was not unusual in our family for financial matters to be handled formally, especially when property and business agreements were involved. Still, the timing felt strange. The party was already in full motion when he walked into the hall. People were eating dessert. The music had grown louder. Several younger cousins had started dancing near the center of the room while the older guests watched from their tables. The lawyer entered quietly through the side door. He was an older man, tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that looked slightly out of place among the bright colors of the celebration. My father greeted him immediately, shaking his hand with visible relief. "You made it," my father said. "Traffic was slow," the lawyer replied calmly. He carried a thin leather folder under his arm. The two men spoke for a few minutes before moving toward the center table where Nadia and her fiancé were sitting. I was standing near the drinks table when I noticed them. At first, the interaction looked routine. My father introduced him to Nadia's fiancé, and the three of them began discussing the documents inside the folder. Several relatives gathered around the table out of curiosity. Engagement paperwork always attracted attention. Samir was standing beside me at the time. He had returned from speaking with one of my uncles and seemed more relaxed than he had earlier. "Who is that?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the man with the folder. "My father's lawyer," I said. He watched the table for a moment. "What kind of paperwork?" "Probably property agreements," I replied. "My parents mentioned something about finalizing things tonight." Samir did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the lawyer carefully. For a moment, I thought he looked uneasy again, but then the expression faded. Across the room, Nadia's fiancé had opened the folder. The lawyer began explaining something while pointing to a page inside the documents. Several relatives leaned closer to listen. I noticed my mother watching from the side with the same alert attention she had shown all evening. Everything still looked normal until the lawyer looked up. It happened quickly. Someone at the table asked a question and he lifted his head to respond. His gaze moved across the room briefly. Then it stopped, directly on Samir. The shift in his expression was small but unmistakable. He did not look away immediately. Instead, he stared. Not the way someone looks at a stranger. The way someone looks when they recognize something they were not expecting to see. Samir noticed it too. I saw the moment his posture stiffened. For several seconds, the two men simply looked at each other across the crowded hall. Then the lawyer lowered his eyes slowly and returned his attention to the documents. The conversation at the table continued, but something had changed. "Do you know him?" I asked Samir quietly. He shook his head. "No, you looked like you recognized him." "I didn't." His answer came too quickly. Across the room, the lawyer turned another page in the folder. Then he spoke again. This time his voice carried slightly farther. "I just need to confirm one detail before we proceed," he said. My father leaned closer. "What detail?" The lawyer glanced briefly toward the guests standing nearby. Then he said something quieter. I could not hear the exact words from where I stood, but I noticed something important. Nadia's fiancé suddenly looked uncomfortable, not dramatically, just a slight tightening in his shoulders. The lawyer continued speaking calmly. He pointed at a section of the document. Then he paused again, and for a second time that evening, his eyes moved across the room. Back to Samir. The pause was longer this time, long enough that two of my cousins noticed. I saw them follow his gaze. Their expressions shifted almost immediately. The kind of subtle reaction people try to hide when they realize they are witnessing something unexpected. Beside me, Samir spoke quietly. I'm going outside for a minute. Why? Just some air. Before I could respond, he was already moving toward the exit near the windows. I watched him leave the hall. Across the room, the lawyer closed the folder halfway. Perhaps we should verify something before continuing, he said. My father frowned slightly. Verify what? The lawyer answered calmly. A name. The word traveled farther than the rest of his sentence. Several people nearby turned their heads. Nadia's fiancé glanced around the room briefly. Then he followed the lawyer's gaze toward the door where Samir had just disappeared. For a moment, no one spoke. And suddenly, the strange tension that had been building all evening felt sharper, more defined. Because the look on the lawyer's face was no longer confusion. It was recognition. And in that moment, I realized something important. The questions I had been asking all night were not the only ones in the room anymore. Someone else had them too, someone with documents in his hands. Someone who seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. For a few seconds after the lawyer said the word name, the table remained quiet, not silent in a dramatic way. The music was still playing across the hall. Plates were still being cleared by the catering staff. Conversations continued at other tables where people had not noticed the shift yet. But the small group gathered around the engagement documents had stopped moving. My father leaned forward slightly. "What name?" he asked. The lawyer did not answer immediately. Instead, he reopened the leather folder and adjusted the top page with careful fingers, as if making sure he was looking at the correct line. When he finally spoke again, his tone remained calm. The documents for this engagement reference a prior financial arrangement connected to one of the properties involved. My father nodded impatiently. Yes, that was already explained. Of course, the lawyer said. But the arrangement includes a former business partner who must be formally acknowledged before the agreement becomes valid. Nadia's fiancé shifted in his chair. That was settled months ago, he said. The lawyer looked at him. Perhaps. The word carried a quiet weight, but I prefer to confirm these things properly. Around the table, a few relatives exchanged uncertain glances. I had moved a little closer by then, standing just behind my aunt's chair. Confirm what exactly? My father asked. The identity of that partner, my father frowned. And why is that necessary tonight? The lawyer closed the folder again. Because I may have just seen him. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning spread quickly through the small circle of people listening. My father followed the direction of the lawyer's earlier gaze toward the side exit. Who? He asked. The lawyer did not answer right away. Instead, he asked a question of his own. The young man who was standing near the drinks table a few minutes ago, he said. The one speaking with your daughter. My father glanced toward me. You mean Samir? The lawyer studied my face for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. The sound of his name in that conversation made my chest tighten. What about him? My father asked. The lawyer rested both hands lightly on the folder. It is possible that I am mistaken, he said. But he looks remarkably similar to someone I encountered during a previous legal dispute involving the same property agreement. The room grew noticeably quieter. Nadia's fiancé spoke again, this time more quickly. There must be some confusion. Perhaps, the lawyer repeated. But confusion is precisely what we try to avoid when property transfers are involved. My mother stepped closer to the table. What are you suggesting? She asked. I'm suggesting nothing yet, the lawyer replied calmly. Only that the resemblance is strong enough to justify confirmation. At that moment, Nadia spoke for the first time since the conversation began. Her voice sounded steady. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Everyone turned toward her. You know him? My father asked. She hesitated for the briefest moment. Only because he's been dating my sister. Several relatives glanced toward me again. I could feel their attention settling there, waiting for my reaction, but I said nothing. Because something about Nadia's tone felt carefully measured, the lawyer nodded slowly. "That may explain the resemblance," he said. Then he asked a question that shifted the entire conversation. "How long have you known him?" Nadia answered quickly. "Not very long." I spoke before I realized I was going to. 2 years. The words surprised several people. Nadia looked at me. "I meant personally," she said, but the correction came too late. The lawyer had already heard the number. 2 years, he repeated thoughtfully. Nadia's fiancé stood up from his chair. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can finish the paperwork later." The lawyer did not move. "I would strongly advise against postponing clarification." "Why?" "Because if my memory is correct," the lawyer said carefully, "the man I am thinking of was involved in a dispute over undisclosed financial interests connected to this property." My father's expression changed. "Undisclosed?" "Yes." The word hung heavily in the air. Across the room, the door near the windows opened again. Samir stepped back inside. He paused when he noticed how many people were standing around the table. Then he saw the lawyer and stopped completely. The two men looked at each other again. This time the recognition was unmistakable. The lawyer's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility but with concentration. Samir did not move closer. He simply stood near the doorway, one hand still resting on the handle. My father turned toward him. "Samir," he said. Several conversations in the hall began fading as more guests noticed the tension forming around the table. "Yes," Samir replied calmly. My father gestured toward the lawyer. "He believes he may have met you before." Samir's gaze moved slowly to the older man. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the lawyer said quietly, "I rarely forget faces connected to legal disputes." Samir's expression remained composed. "I think you may be mistaken." The lawyer tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps." Then he asked a final question. "Have you ever been involved in a property partnership with Mr. Rahman?" The name belonged to Nadia's fiancé. Samir did not answer immediately. And in that pause, something shifted inside the room, because several people had already begun to realize what the question implied. Not a simple misunderstanding, something deeper, something that suggested connections between people who were supposed to be strangers. I looked at Nadia. She was watching Samir very carefully, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with the tense focus of someone waiting to see what he would say next. And in that moment, I understood something that made the evening feel suddenly colder. My sister was not hearing this information for the first time. Samir did not answer the lawyer's question immediately. The pause was not dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one stepped forward. But the space between the question and his response felt longer than it should have been, because everyone at the table was watching him now. Even people who did not fully understand the conversation had begun to sense that something unusual was happening. The music continued in the background, but fewer people were dancing. More guests had turned their attention toward the small group surrounding the documents. The lawyer waited patiently. "Have you ever been involved in a property partnership with Mr. Rahman?" Samir finally stepped closer to the table. His movements were slow and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "No," the answer came without hesitation this time. The lawyer studied his face for several seconds, then he nodded slightly. "That is a very clear answer." "Yes," Samir said, but the conversation did not end there. The lawyer opened the folder again and removed a single sheet from the stack of documents. "This agreement references an intermediary consultant," he said, "someone who assisted in negotiating the earlier stages of the property transfer." Nadia's fiancé shifted uncomfortably again. That consultant is no longer involved, he said quickly. I understand, the lawyer replied, but his signature appears on several preliminary filings. He placed the sheet gently on the table. I only wish to confirm whether that individual is present in this room. No one moved. My father looked confused. What consultant? He asked. Nadia's fiancé avoided his eyes. It was a temporary arrangement, he said. The lawyer turned the paper slightly so the writing faced him again. Then he read a name quietly. Samir Khan. The spelling was slightly different, but the sound of the name was almost identical. Every muscle in my body felt suddenly still. My father looked at Samir. Is that you? Samir did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Nadia. It was a brief glance, but it was enough, because in that moment I saw something pass between them. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. My sister spoke quickly. That can't be the same person, she said. The lawyer looked up at her. Perhaps not, he said calmly, but the resemblance is quite strong. Nadia shook her head. There are many people with that name. Yes, the lawyer said. That is true. Then he turned his attention back to Samir. Would you be willing to confirm your full name for the record? Samir's hands remained at his sides. For the first time that evening, I noticed that he looked slightly tired. Not nervous, just tired. My name is Samir Khan, he said. The room felt even quieter after he spoke. The lawyer nodded slowly. And have you ever worked as a consultant on real estate negotiations? Samir looked at the paper on the table, then back at the lawyer. Not officially. The answer created a small ripple of whispers among the relatives nearby. Not officially, my father repeated. Samir remained calm. I advised someone on a few discussions. Who? My father asked. Samir hesitated, and again his eyes moved toward Nadia. This time the glance lasted longer. My father followed it. Slowly, he looked at my sister. Nadia! She looked startled now, but the reaction came a little too late. I don't know what you're implying, she said. The lawyer spoke again. The earlier negotiations involved Mr. Rahman's company. That was Nadia's fiancé. And this consultant, the lawyer continued, tapping the paper gently, helped structure the original payment schedule. Nadia's fiancé stood up abruptly. This is irrelevant, he said. The lawyer did not react. It becomes relevant, he said quietly, if the consultant failed to disclose his continued financial interest in the property. My father looked at Samir again. Do you have a financial interest in this property? Samir did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, for the first time all evening. The expression on his face was not defensive, not angry, just resigned. And suddenly the pieces that had been floating around my mind all night began to settle into place. The private conversations, the careful questions, the way Nadia had spoken to him by the window, the glances between relatives, the way everyone had dismissed my concerns earlier. They had not dismissed them because nothing was wrong. They had dismissed them because they did not want the truth appearing during the engagement. And the worst part was not that Samir had hidden something. It was that my sister had known. I felt the realization settle slowly inside my chest. Heavy, unavoidable, my father spoke again. Samir, he said, answer the question. Samir exhaled quietly. Yes, he said. The single word changed the entire room. Yes, he repeated. I still have a financial interest. A few relatives gasped softly. My mother covered her mouth. Nadia's fiancé stared at him in disbelief. You told us you sold everything, he said. Samir's voice remained steady. I sold most of it. Most, my father repeated. The lawyer closed the folder gently. I believe, he said calmly, that we now understand why this clarification was necessary. No one spoke for several seconds. People across the hall were watching openly now. And in that silence, I realized something important. I could interrupt. I could demand explanations. I could ask the questions that had been building inside me all evening. But instead, I did something else. I remained quiet. Because for the first time that night, the truth was no longer hiding behind conversations. It was standing in the center of the room, and it did not need my voice to reveal itself. Once the word yes left Samir's mouth, the atmosphere in the hall changed in a way that no decoration or music could disguise. Not everyone understood what had happened, but enough people did. The conversations near the engagement table had grown quiet, and the silence spread outward slowly as relatives leaned toward each other to ask careful questions. "What did he say? What does that mean?" My father stood very still beside the table. "Explain," he said. He was not shouting. But the calm in his voice felt heavier than anger would have. Samir did not raise his voice either. "There was an earlier investment," he said. "A small one." "A small one," Nadia's fiancé repeated. "Yes, you told me everything had been resolved." "It mostly was." The lawyer adjusted the papers in his folder again. "Mr. Khan," he said politely, "the concern is not the size of the investment." Samir looked at him. "The concern," the lawyer continued, "is whether that interest was properly disclosed when the engagement agreement was prepared." My father looked confused. "What agreement?" he asked. "The financial structure attached to the property transfer," the lawyer explained. Several relatives exchanged uncertain looks. Those details had never been discussed openly before. The lawyer continued calmly. "The property involved in this engagement will transfer partial ownership once the marriage is formalized." My mother's expression changed slightly. "This was arranged for Nadia's future security," she said quietly. The lawyer nodded. "Yes." Then he gestured lightly toward Samir. "If an undisclosed financial interest remains connected to the property, it creates a legal conflict." The word conflict moved through the group like a quiet ripple. Nadia's fiancé spoke again. "You said you sold your share," he told Samir. "I sold the majority," Samir replied. "That's not what you said." Samir did not respond to that. My father finally looked at Nadia. "You knew about this?" The question landed heavily. Nadia hesitated, only for a second. "Yes," she said. The admission surprised several people standing nearby. My father stared at her. "You knew." "It wasn't important," she said quickly. "Not important," my mother repeated. "It was a small technical issue," Nadia insisted. "It was supposed to be handled before the engagement was finalized." The lawyer spoke carefully. "If that had happened, I would have documentation confirming the transfer." He tapped the folder gently. "At the moment, I do not." Nadia's fiancé ran a hand across his face. "This is unbelievable." His voice was not loud, but the frustration in it was unmistakable. "You told me everything was clean," he said to Samir. "It mostly was," Samir repeated. "That's not the same thing." Across the room, guests were watching openly now. Some of them had moved closer. Others stood near their tables pretending to continue conversations while clearly listening. The engagement celebration had quietly turned into something else. A review, a correction, a moment where appearances were no longer enough to hold the evening together. My father looked from Samir to Nadia again. "And you knew about this," he said. "Yes," she replied quietly. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was supposed to be temporary." "Temporary," my father repeated. She nodded. "Samir said it would be resolved before tonight." The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "That would have been advisable," he said. The calmness of his voice made the consequences clearer than any argument could. "Until the matter is clarified," he continued, "the property agreement attached to this engagement cannot be finalized." My mother lowered herself slowly into the nearest chair. The realization had finally reached her. "You mean?" Yes, the lawyer said gently. The documents cannot proceed tonight. Nadia's fiancé looked at Samir again. This time there was no confusion in his expression, only disappointment. You put us in a very difficult position, he said. Samir did not defend himself. He simply stood there quietly. Across the table, I noticed several relatives who had mocked my relationship earlier in the evening. The same people who had smiled politely when I asked questions. Now they were silent. Some avoided looking at me. Others stared at the floor or the documents on the table. The engagement decorations still hung around the room. The music was still playing softly, but the celebration had stopped. Not with an argument, not with a dramatic announcement, just with the quiet authority of records and signatures. Because once the documents were questioned, nothing else in the room mattered more. And the truth that had been treated like a minor inconvenience all evening was now the only thing anyone could see. The evening did not end with shouting. In some ways, that made it feel heavier. People did not rush out of the hall. No one demanded explanations in front of everyone. The decorations remained in place, the lights still warm against the walls, the music still playing softly as if the celebration had only paused. But the energy in the room had changed. Guests began leaving in small groups. Conversations were quieter now, careful and restrained. Some relatives avoided looking at our table entirely as they walked toward the exit. Others gave polite goodbyes that felt incomplete. The lawyer packed his documents slowly before speaking privately with my father and Nadia's fiancé. I did not hear the details of their conversation, but I saw the expressions on their faces. Nothing about it looked simple anymore. Nadia stayed near the center table for a long time. Several relatives spoke with her quietly, offering reassurance that sounded more formal than comforting. Her fiancé stood beside her, his posture rigid, listening to explanations that no longer seemed to matter. Samir remained near the doorway. He did not approach the table again. He did not try to speak to me. For a long time, neither of us moved. Eventually, he walked across the room. He stopped a few steps away from me, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I didn't plan for it to happen like this. I looked at him for a moment. Then I nodded once. I believed him. But belief did not change anything. Across the room, my mother was speaking quietly with my father. Several relatives watched them from a distance, their earlier confidence replaced with careful silence. Earlier that evening, some of those same people had smiled when I questioned what I was seeing. Now no one seemed interested in explaining anything to me, and strangely, I did not need them to. Because the truth had revealed itself without arguments, without accusations, without anyone needing to raise their voice. It had arrived through records, through names written on documents, through a lawyer who simply recognized a face. By the time I left the hall, most of the decorations were still hanging where they had been placed hours earlier. But the celebration they were meant for had quietly disappeared. No one stopped me at the door, and for the first time that night, the silence felt honest.